The SOS signal emerges. The planet of Iridian had always been peaceful, nestled in the far corner of the galaxy. Its inhabitants, a race of intelligent beings, had lived harmoniously for centuries. The skies were clear, the cities were flourishing, and the people were content. Life on Iridian was simple, and most of the population had never known the fear of war or conflict. They were a proud species, but they had never faced an enemy capable of breaking their calm existence. But that was about to change. One quiet evening, just as the sun began to set over the tranquil landscape, a strange signal was detected. The planet's communication hub picked it up, a faint distress signal. It was weak, barely audible, but unmistakable. The message was fragmented, almost as if the person sending it was struggling to stay alive. Help. We need help. The invaders, too powerful, can't. Hold on. The words were barely legible, but the fear in the voice was clear. A chill ran through the heart of every person who heard it. The message wasn't from any of Iridian's neighbors. It was from a distant, unknown source. The colony leaders immediately gathered in their war room, studying the message. The SOS had been sent from a planet in a neighboring galaxy, far beyond Iridian's known borders. Their first thought was that it could be a hoax, some kind of test or mistake. But something about the tone of the message made them pause. The desperation was too real. The voice sounded like it was at the edge of death, as if it was being broadcast through the last remnants of life. "This isn't a prank," Commander Varlan said, his voice thick with concern. He was a seasoned leader, and this was the first time he had ever encountered something so unsettling. "The source is too far for us to reach quickly, but we must respond." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled on everyone's shoulders. Iridian had no military forces. This peaceful world had never needed them. They were a race of scholars, artists, and diplomats, not soldiers. Their world had been a beacon of peace for as long as anyone could remember. The thought of facing a real war seemed unimaginable. "We need to send a message," Varlan continued. "We need to tell them that help is on the way." As the leaders worked to send a response, questions began to form in the minds of the people. Who had sent the SOS? What kind of enemy could be powerful enough to send a plea for help? The colonists had no answers, but the clock was ticking. They knew they could not ignore the call for help, even if it came from an unknown world. The first challenge was communication. Iridian's technology was advanced, but their military capabilities were non-existent. They had never faced an enemy, let alone one that would make them rely on warships and soldiers. The people of Iridian were engineers, doctors, and philosophers, not warriors. Varlan stood before the council, staring at the flickering holographic map of the galaxy. The enemy was unknown, but the distress signal was real. And time was running out. The invaders were already on the move, and the planet was being overwhelmed. The message had been sent just before the invaders cut off communication. There was no time to waste. "We will have to do something," said Zira, a young scientist who had spent her career studying alien species. "Even if it means contacting the few warlords we've heard about in the galaxy, we can't ignore this. If these invaders are as powerful as the signal suggests, Iridian could be next." Varlan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Prepare the fleet for launch. It's time we reach out to whoever we can." But even as they began preparing to launch a fleet of ships, deep down, they knew there was something else at play, something beyond their understanding. The galaxy was filled with mysterious species and powerful forces, and they were about to be thrust into a conflict they were ill prepared for. The leaders of Iridian had never had to consider the true nature of war, but as the distress signal played again in their ears, they realized they were facing a threat beyond anything they had ever imagined. The invaders were coming, and they weren't interested in negotiation or peace. Varlan stared out of the council room window, looking out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the mountains. "We've been too complacent," he said quietly, as if to himself. "The galaxy has always seemed so peaceful, so kind. But there are dark forces out there, forces that we cannot understand. Suddenly, another message came through. This one was clear, louder, and even more urgent. They're here. The invaders have arrived. Help us, please. We can't hold on much longer. The signal ended abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. The council knew what they had to do. They weren't just answering a distress call. They were stepping into a war they never saw coming. The first response was sent. Help is on the way. But they had no idea just how high the stakes were, or what kind of saviors they were about to summon. The only thing they knew for certain was that the battle had already begun. The mysterious response. The distress signal had barely faded when a second transmission came through, this time clear and uninterrupted. Commander Varlin stood in the control room, his brow furrowed as he listened carefully. This new message wasn't like the first. It wasn't from the planet in distress. It was something entirely different. The voice was calm, too calm for the situation, and the words were simple but direct. Help is on the way. For a brief moment, no one in the control room spoke. Everyone exchanged nervous glances. It didn't make sense. The Iridian were a peaceful people, and they had no military forces capable of responding to such a dire situation. This new message wasn't from any known ally or group. There were no signs of any neighboring systems offering help. Who was sending this message, and how could they be so confident that help was coming? Varlin leaned closer to the communication panel. The words were clear, but there was no indication of the sender's identity. It wasn't a message from an ally or another peaceful race. It was a message from an unknown source. It was as if whoever had sent it already knew they were coming. Who sent this? Zira asked, her voice filled with unease. This doesn't make sense. How can they be so sure help is coming? We don't know, Varlin replied, his voice low. But we must find out. Now. The Iridian leaders rushed to analyze the transmission, but they couldn't trace its origin. It was almost as though the message had been relayed through a series of hidden channels, masking its true source. Zira's fingers flew across the console, trying to access any data that might help. She glanced up at Varlin, her face pale. There's nothing here. It's as if it came from nowhere. The silence in the room was suffocating. The implication of the message began to sink in. Someone was coming to help, but the mystery deepened with every passing second. No one on Iridian had any idea who these mysterious saviors were, and the more they tried to understand, the more questions arose. We don't have time to figure this out, Varlin said, trying to focus the team. We need to prepare ourselves, just in case. Whoever this is, they might arrive sooner than we think. A strange sense of anticipation hung in the air, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The threat from the invaders was still looming, and the Iridians' options were running out. Without a clear understanding of who had sent the message, they had to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Over the next few hours, the colony scrambled to get ready. The small fleet of ships they had was being reconfigured for potential combat, though none of them had ever seen a real battle. The peaceful people of Iridian weren't soldiers. They didn't know how to fight an advanced, ruthless enemy. But as the minutes ticked by, the threat felt more real, and the urgency grew stronger. Then, just as things seemed to settle, another transmission came through. It wasn't a message, it was a signal. A massive blinding light appeared on the horizon, seen by every telescope, every viewing screen, and even by the naked eye. It was a ship, unlike anything they had ever seen. It didn't resemble any familiar design. They couldn't even recognize its structure. It was enormous, glowing with strange energy, and it moved with terrifying speed. The ground trembled slightly as the ship entered Iridian's atmosphere, dwarfing everything below it. It was as though the ship had arrived out of nowhere, materializing from the depths of space itself. The fear that gripped the colony leaders was palpable. Was this the help they had been waiting for? Or had the mysterious ship arrived with its own agenda? Zira's voice cracked as she spoke into the comms. We We've never seen anything like this before. It's too powerful. It's... She paused, struggling to find the words. It's not one of us. The ship's descent continued, its massive form blotting out the sky. It wasn't just vague, it was intimidating. The mere sight of it sent a ripple of unease through the entire planet. "Prepare for landing," Varlon commanded. "Whatever or whoever is on that ship, we need to meet them. Now." As the giant vessel touched down, the Iridian leaders and their people gathered in the designated landing zone, anxiety building with each passing second. The air was thick with anticipation, and the planet held its collective breath. What kind of beings would emerge from this monstrous ship? Were they allies or something far more dangerous? Then, the ship's door opened, and the beings that stepped out were nothing like anything Iridian had encountered. They were massive, larger than the average Iridian by far. Their armor was intimidating, black and metallic with designs that appeared alien and lethal. They moved with military precision, their presence overwhelming. Their eyes were hidden beneath helmets, but their posture screamed authority. These were no diplomats or scholars. These were warriors. One of the larger figures stepped forward and spoke in a deep, resonating voice, though it wasn't in any language the Iridian had ever heard. But the Iridian were quick learners, and through their advanced technology, a translation device soon turned the strange words into something they could understand. "We are the Deathworlders. We received your call. Now we fight." And just like that, the reality of war, the true nature of their unknown saviors, began to unfold. The fate of Iridian and the unknown enemy would now rest in the hands of these terrifying warriors. The questions about who they were and why they had come would have to wait. The battle was about to begin. The mysterious response had arrived, and Iridian had no choice but to trust the Deathworlders, whether they liked it or not. The arrival of the Deathworlders. The massive ship loomed over the Iridian city, casting a long shadow as it settled onto the ground. The air was heavy with tension, and the atmosphere buzzed with uncertainty. The Iridian leaders, standing at the edge of the landing zone, could only stare up at the enormous vessel. The sheer size of it was intimidating, but it was the soldiers emerging from the ship that truly struck fear into their hearts. The Deathworlders were unlike anything Iridian had ever seen. They were massive, easily twice the height of the average Iridian, and their armor was both sleek and formidable. It shimmered in the dimming light of the evening, black and reflective, but also etched with strange, alien patterns. Their helmets were dark and intimidating, and their movements were precise, military-like. They didn't speak, but the sound of their heavy boots hitting the ground was enough to send a chill down the spines of everyone present. As the first row of Deathworlders stepped onto the planet's surface, Varlon could feel his heart racing. There was no time to hesitate. These beings were not here to negotiate. They were here to fight. But fight for Iridian, or against it. Varlon cleared his throat, his voice steady, but filled with uncertainty. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to muster the courage to address their leader. The figure who stepped forward was a few inches taller than the rest. His posture was upright and commanding. He surveyed the Iridian with a cold, calculating gaze. "We are the Deathworlders," the leader said, his voice deep, gravelly, and full of authority. "We are your allies. We fight for survival, and we fight for you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. It was clear that these warriors had no interest in diplomacy or long discussions. They were here for one thing, to fight. But Varlon still couldn't shake the unease in his gut. The question remained, what exactly were these Deathworlders, and why had they chosen to help? The leader of the Deathworlders continued, his words deliberate. "The invaders are a threat unlike any you've ever seen. Their weapons, their tactics, they are ruthless and efficient. But so are we, and we will show you what true warriors are capable of." He turned and motioned for his soldiers to spread out. The ground shook with each step they took, as if the very earth beneath them trembled at the might of these giants. The Iridian, in contrast, stood frozen in place, watching in awe and fear. They had never seen anything like this before. These beings were so far beyond their level of technology and experience that it was impossible to comprehend. Zira, unable to hide her curiosity, spoke up. "But why us? Why help Iridian? What do you want in return?" The Deathworlder leader didn't respond right away. Instead, he seemed to study Zira, as though weighing her words carefully. Then, after a moment of silence, he spoke. "We fight for survival, for our home. Your people's plea for help was heard by us, and we respond to calls like this because, in the end, we all share the same enemy." Varlun still felt uneasy, but he knew there was no time to question their motives further. The invaders were still out there, and they were growing closer. The Iridian had no military might to defend themselves, but the Deathworlders had come to their aid. Now, they would have to place their trust in them, no matter how unsettling that felt. "We need to prepare," Varlun said, snapping back to the reality of the situation. "Gather the people. We will need every resource at our disposal if we are to survive this." The Deathworlders began to organize, their movements swift and efficient. They immediately set up a perimeter around the landing site, deploying strange devices and setting up defensive positions. They didn't speak much to the Iridian. They didn't need to. The Deathworlders operated with a confidence that only came from years of battle-hardened experience. Zira watched in awe as the Deathworlders worked with a sense of purpose that was almost hypnotic. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. They were already acting as if they had been fighting alongside the Iridian for years. "They know what they're doing," Zira muttered, more to herself than anyone else. This is what they were made for. The reality of the situation began to sink in. The Iridian had no choice but to accept the Deathworlders as their allies. They would need their strength, their weapons, and their knowledge if they were to have any hope of surviving the coming war. The invaders, still on their way, were relentless and brutal. But the Deathworlders, they were warriors to the core, and they were not afraid of battle. Varlun watched as the first group of Deathworlder soldiers set up large cannons and energy shields, the likes of which Iridian had never seen. The ground vibrated as they powered up their equipment. It was a testament to the Deathworlders' advanced technology and their unshakable readiness for war. "How soon until the invaders arrive?" Zira asked, her voice filled with both dread and fascination. The Deathworlder leader turned to her. "They are close," he said flatly, "but we will be ready, and we will fight. We will show them that Iridian is not a world to be conquered." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the planet of Iridian stood on the edge of a new reality. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the battle for their world was about to begin. But with them, the Iridian now had hope, and as they watched the Deathworlders prepare for battle, they began to realize that this would not be a fight they faced alone. The invaders would soon be upon them, but for the first time in a long while, the Iridian felt ready to face whatever came next. The warriors they had called to the battlefield were no ordinary fighters. They were Deathworlders, an unstoppable force, and they were about to show the invaders what true power looked like. The Deathworlders' strength. The ground rumbled as the Deathworlders' massive cannons powered up, their energy shields humming with an eerie, crackling sound. The Iridians stood in awe, watching these towering figures prepare for battle. The Deathworlders, with their dark armor and advanced weaponry, looked like a force of nature. Their presence alone was enough to make anyone question the invaders' chances of success. Commander Varlun stood at the command center, his eyes scanning the monitors. They had received no further communications from the invaders, but the incoming signals were growing stronger by the minute. They were coming. The question wasn't if, but when. And when they arrived, the Iridian would need to be ready. Status report. Varlun called to the technicians and soldiers working frantically around him. "We've detected movement in the atmosphere," Zira responded, her voice tight with tension. "The invaders are approaching. We estimate they'll arrive in less than 30 minutes. Varlin nodded. The time for preparations was nearly over. The Deathworlders had already set up their defenses, massive energy barriers that shimmered across the landscape, as well as automated turrets positioned around the city's perimeter. But there was something more to them than just their technology. It was the way they moved, the way they prepared. The Deathworlders weren't just setting up defenses. They were preparing for something much bigger. They were preparing for war. Make sure the civilian population is safe. Evacuate them to the underground shelters immediately, Varlin instructed, his voice calm but firm. As the order was passed through the communication systems, the Iridian people began to retreat into the safety of their underground shelters, leaving the warriors and defenders to face what was coming. It was clear that the invaders weren't going to be stopped easily. They had come with one goal in mind: to conquer. But the Deathworlders had already made it clear they weren't just here to defend. They were here to dominate. The first signs of the invaders' fleet appeared on the horizon. Small, sleek ships, bristling with weaponry, descended toward the surface. They moved in coordinated patterns, almost like a swarm of predators closing in on their prey. The air grew tense with anticipation, and the sound of the approaching ships could be felt in the bones of every Iridian standing on the surface. As the ships drew nearer, the Deathworlder leader, known only as Kor, issued the command. His voice was steady, unwavering. As he addressed his soldiers, "Position yourselves," he ordered. "We do not retreat. We do not yield." The Deathworlders spread out across the field, their massive bodies moving with grace and speed that belied their size. Their weapons powered up, glowing with energy. Their armor hummed with the unmistakable sound of lethal efficiency. The Iridian watched, unable to comprehend how these warriors were so calm, so confident. But the moment the invaders landed, that confidence would be tested. The Deathworlders had no illusions about the challenge ahead. They knew what was coming, and they were ready. The invaders finally touched down, their ships screeching to a halt on the rocky terrain. They had arrived, and they were no ordinary invaders. Their armor was sleek, almost insectoid, and their weapons were as deadly as anything the Deathworlders had ever seen. But it wasn't just the technology that made them dangerous. It was their sheer numbers. Hundreds of soldiers poured out of their ships, their eyes glowing with an unsettling predatory gleam. They had no hesitation, no fear. They were here to conquer, and nothing would stand in their way. But the Deathworlders weren't going to let them. Kor raised his hand, signaling the attack, and in an instant, the air was filled with the sound of battle. The Deathworlders opened fire with their massive weapons, and the first line of invaders was torn apart by blasts of concentrated energy. The ground shook with the impact of the explosions, and the sky lit up with flashes of light. The invaders didn't falter, however. They charged forward, their weapons flashing with deadly intent. But the Deathworlders were faster. They moved with a deadly grace, evading the invaders' attacks with ease. Their armor seemed to absorb the impacts, their shields flickering only momentarily before returning to full strength. The invaders, despite their numbers, were being pushed back by the ferocity of the Deathworlders' assault. Kor led the charge, his massive sword glowing with energy as he cut through the invaders' ranks. Each swing of his blade sent shockwaves through the enemy, cutting through armor and flesh alike. His soldiers followed his lead, unleashing devastating firepower that tore through the invaders' defenses. The air was filled with the sounds of blasters, explosions, and the unrelenting march of the Deathworlders. The Iridian watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the sheer power of their new allies. These warriors were nothing like the peaceful people they had once been. They were fierce, unyielding, and relentless. The invaders' attacks, no matter how powerful, were being repelled by the Deathworlders with brutal efficiency. But it wasn't just their strength that made them formidable, it was their strategy. The Deathworlders knew how to fight. They knew how to strike with precision, how to exploit every weakness in their enemies' defenses. Every move was calculated, every attack planned. And as the invaders began to falter under the relentless assault, it became clear the Deathworlders were not only capable of stopping the invaders, they were capable of destroying them. Varlin stood at the command center, watching as the invaders' forces began to break. The Deathworlders' firepower, combined with their unmatched combat skills, was too much for the invaders to handle. Their lines were crumbling, their ships falling from the sky. It was clear now, the Iridian might just have a chance at survival. The invaders, realizing they were losing, tried to retreat, but it was too late. The Deathworlders weren't about to let them escape. The final wave of attacks came, and with it, the end of the invaders' invasion. As the last invader fell, Kor surveyed the battlefield, his breath steady. "We have won this day," he said, his voice filled with both pride and satisfaction. But the war is far from over. This was only the beginning. The Iridian, who had once feared the unknown, now understood something profound. They were no longer alone. The Deathworlders had brought their strength to the battlefield. And with it, hope. But the true fight had only just begun. The invaders were only the first of many challenges ahead. And the Deathworlders would be ready. A deadly secret uncovered. As the battlefield settled, the smoke and debris of war hung thick in the air. The Iridian watched in awe as the Deathworlders moved through the wreckage, ensuring that the last remnants of the invader forces were dealt with. There was no celebration, no cheering. The Deathworlders simply moved with quiet efficiency, checking for survivors, confirming kills, and ensuring that their enemies would not rise again. Varlin stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Iridian had survived this first battle, but he knew that this victory was only temporary. The invaders had been defeated, but what if more were coming? What if this was only the beginning? "Commander," Zira's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone sharp with urgency. She was standing near one of the fallen invader ships, scanning the wreckage with a portable device. "You need to see this." Varlin moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen Zira work before. She was one of the smartest minds in Iridian. And when she was this focused, it meant something serious was happening. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. Zira looked up from her device, her face pale. "I think we missed something important. There's something in their technology, something we didn't notice at first." Varlin's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She gestured to the wreckage. "These invaders weren't just here to conquer. There's something much darker at play. They have weapons, yes, but they're ships. They're designed for something else. Something biological." Varlin's stomach twisted. "Biological?" Zira nodded grimly. "Their technology isn't just military. It's tied to some kind of weapon. A weapon that's been hidden in their ships." Varlin stepped closer, trying to understand. "What kind of weapon?" Zira tapped a few more commands into her device, pulling up a hologram of the invader ship's internal structure. As the diagram shifted, something chilling became clear. It looks like they were preparing to release something that would have wiped out the entire population of Iridian. Varlin's throat went dry. "A virus? A toxin?" "Not exactly," Zira said, her voice filled with unease. "They were using a biological agent that could have turned the planet's atmosphere toxic to Iridian life. It wasn't just about conquest. The invaders weren't interested in colonizing Iridian. They were planning to annihilate us completely. Their ships were equipped to release this agent over the entire surface." The revelation hit Varlin like a physical blow. The invaders hadn't just been a threat. They were an existential danger, planning the complete eradication of his people. The Deathworlders had arrived just in time, not only to save Iridian from military conquest, but also from a genocide that would have wiped them out without a trace. Zira continued, her face grave. "If we hadn't stopped them when we did, it would have been over. No one would have known what happened to Iridian." Varlin clenched his fists, trying to hold back the surge of anger and fear rising within him. The Iridian had barely survived the attack, and they would have never even known what had been planned for them. But the Deathworlders had known. They had recognized the danger from the start, and they had taken action before it was too late. "We need to tell the others," Varlon said, his voice thick with determination. "This is not just about fighting back anymore. We need to prepare. The Deathworlders may have won this battle, but we have to make sure this doesn't happen again." As he turned to make his way back to the command center, Zira's voice stopped him. "Commander, there's more." Varlam stopped, turning back to her. "More? What do you mean?" Zira's eyes were fixed on the device, and there was an unsettling look in her expression. "It's not just the invaders. This weapon, they've used it before. And they have allies. There are other forces at play here, bigger ones." Varlan's heart skipped a beat. "Allies? Who else is involved?" Zira took a deep breath, her fingers tapping nervously at the device. "It's unclear, but there's a trace of the same technology, the same biological weapon, in several other systems. This invasion was part of a larger plan, a coordinated effort to wipe out several species in the galaxy." Varlon felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Iridian was not the first target. It had been chosen because it was a peaceful planet, an easy target for whatever dark force had orchestrated the attack. And if they could invade Iridian, they could do it to anyone. The Deathworlders had been their saviors, but the truth was more terrifying than they could have imagined. The invaders weren't just rogue soldiers. They were part of something far more dangerous, something far more powerful. The Deathworlders had stopped the immediate threat, but Varlan knew now that the fight was far from over. The galaxy was about to be thrown into a war that would involve more than just Iridian. The enemies of the Deathworlders and Iridian were many, and they were all working together. As Varlan stood there, watching the smoke clear from the battlefield, the weight of the new reality settled in. Iridian had been saved, but the cost of survival might be much higher than they realized. The battle for their world was just the beginning. Now, the true war was about to begin. A last stand. The calm after the battle was deceptive. Despite the victory, the true weight of the situation pressed down on everyone. The invaders had been pushed back, their biological weapon dismantled, and their fleet destroyed. But the discovery that they were part of something much larger, the galactic network of forces with a single devastating goal, left the Iridian leaders and the Deathworlders with no illusion. This was far from over. Commander Varlan stood with Zira, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the jagged mountains. The city, which had been shaken by the conflict, was still standing, but the world was forever changed. The sounds of the Deathworlders working in the distance, fortifying the city and reinforcing defenses, served as a constant reminder of the new reality. Iridian had survived this battle, but there was no telling how long it would last. The next attack could come at any moment. Zira spoke first, her voice soft, but filled with a kind of grim determination. "We've had some time to look at the intel we recovered from the invader ships. It's not good." Varlan turned toward her, his eyes hardening. "What do you mean?" "The network they're a part of," Zira continued. "It's vast. There are dozens of systems involved, some of them very far from here. And they all have the same goal, destroying peaceful worlds like ours." Varlan clenched his jaw. The galaxy was filled with conflict, but this kind of organized aggression was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about conquest. It was about eliminating any and all worlds that didn't fit into their vision of the galaxy. "We don't have the manpower or the technology to face them on our own," Zira said, the weight of their situation sinking in. "We'll need help, and not just from the Deathworlders." Varlan nodded. "We'll need to form alliances, convince others that this threat is real before it's too late. But we can't waste time. The invaders will regroup. And when they do, they'll come for us again. Only this time, they won't be caught off guard." The sense of urgency was palpable as the Deathworlders continued their work. They were setting up perimeter defenses, scanning for more invader ships, and ensuring the survival of the Iridian. But even they knew that the peace they had won would be fleeting. The reality of the next phase of the war was looming. As Varlin and Zira turned to return to the command center, a new transmission arrived. This one from Kor, the leader of the Deathworlders. His face was serious, his voice grim. "We've detected more invader ships approaching," Kor said. "Not just a few, a fleet, and it's heading directly for Iridian. This time, they won't come in small numbers. This will be a full-scale assault." Varlin's heart sank. The calm they had fought so hard for had been shattered in an instant. The invaders had regrouped faster than they had anticipated. And now, they were bringing an entire fleet. "This is it," Zira whispered, her face pale. "The last stand. If we don't stop them now, we won't get another chance." Varlin's mind raced. They had no choice. They had to defend their planet, no matter the cost. But this time, they couldn't rely solely on the Deathworlders' strength. The invasion was too large, the enemy too powerful. If they didn't stand together, if they didn't make their final stand, Iridian might fall. "We need to rally every ally we can," Varlin said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Send out the call. Everyone. This battle will determine the fate of Iridian and many other worlds. We can't fight this war alone." The Deathworlders had already demonstrated their strength, their courage, and their unyielding resolve. But the numbers they faced this time were overwhelming. The invasion fleet would outnumber them, and their forces were far more advanced. Varlin knew that without additional support, Iridian would not survive the coming storm. As the Iridian forces scrambled to prepare for the coming battle, Kor's voice cut through the chaos, his tone resolute. "We fight. We fight for our survival. We fight for Iridian." The Deathworlders had made it clear. They weren't here just to help. They were here to ensure that Iridian would never fall into the hands of the invaders. Their strength and commitment to the fight were unwavering. But even with their superior combat skills, they couldn't win this battle alone. Time was running out. The invader fleet was already on the move, and the clock was ticking. Iridian needed more than just soldiers. It needed unity. As the Deathworlders worked to bolster their defenses, Varlin took one final look at the horizon, where the first signs of the approaching enemy fleet could be seen in the sky. He knew that this was the defining moment. It was not just the fate of Iridian that hung in the balance, but the future of many worlds in the galaxy. And now, it was time to fight, together. "Prepare for the final stand," Varlin ordered, his voice filled with an unwavering certainty. "We will not let them take our world. We will not fall." The sky above Iridian darkened as the invader fleet descended, its sheer size blurring the line between space and atmosphere. The battle was about to begin, and Iridian, with its Deathworlder allies, was ready to make its last stand, the final victory, or sacrifice. The sky above Iridian was alive with the flash of lasers, the roar of explosions, and the deafening hum of battle. The invader fleet had arrived in full force, their ships descending in waves, each one more imposing than the last. The Deathworlders, along with the Iridian defenders, stood ready at the planet's surface, their combined forces preparing for the last decisive fight. Every moment felt like an eternity as the fleet grew larger on the horizon, casting a dark shadow over the battlefield. Varlin stood at the front of the command center, his eyes locked on the unfolding battle. The Deathworlders had already proven their strength and resilience, but now, the true test had come. This wasn't just about defense. This was a final push to secure Iridian's future and ensure that the invaders would never return. "Commander," Zira's voice broke through his thoughts. She was monitoring the situation from the tactical console, her face tight with anxiety. "We've got a problem. The invader fleet is using a new kind of weapon. It's targeting our defenses, specifically the energy shields. It looks like they're trying to break through our lines." Varlin's jaw tightened. How long before they reached the city? Not long, Zira said, her voice strained. If we don't stop them now, the shields will fall. The Deathworlders are holding them off, but it's taking all their strength. We need reinforcements. The tension in the command room was palpable. The Iridian had never fought a battle like this, and even the Deathworlders, with their advanced weaponry and unmatched combat prowess, were starting to show signs of strain. But then, just as the invader ships began to break through the outer defenses, a new force appeared in the sky. A fleet. It wasn't from the Iridian. It wasn't from the Deathworlders either. The ships were sleek, agile, and unmistakably alien. They were here, the allies Varlon had called in, a coalition of distant systems, responding to the threat that had reached Iridian's doorstep. They're here, Varlon said, barely able to contain the relief in his voice. The reinforcements have arrived. The new fleet moved quickly, swooping in to join the battle. They made an immediate impact, their advanced technology coordinating seamlessly with the Deathworlders' defensive lines. The enemy forces began to falter, their momentum slowing as the battle turned into a fierce, bloody conflict. But it wasn't enough. Varlon watched as the invader fleet continued to press on, more determined than ever to destroy Iridian. The battle was far from over. In fact, it seemed like it was just beginning to reach its peak. The invaders had unleashed their full might, their weapons firing with terrifying accuracy, their ships relentlessly bombarding the planet's surface. It became clear to Varlon that, even with the reinforcements, this battle would not be won through strength alone. It would take a sacrifice. We need to take out their flagship, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. If we destroy their command ship, we can cripple their entire fleet. Zira's eyes widened. How do you plan to do that? Their flagship is heavily shielded, and they've got more than enough firepower to wipe us out before we even get close. I'll lead a team of Deathworlders to their flagship, Varlon said, his decision final. We'll board it, disable their power core, and make sure they can't keep up their assault. The Deathworlders can provide the cover fire we need. Zira hesitated, a look of concern flashing across her face. Varlon, if you do this, there's no coming back. The flagship is practically a fortress. I know, Varlon said, his gaze hardening. But if we don't act now, Iridian will fall. The Deathworlders and our allies are fighting for our survival, but it's up to us to finish this. We'll need to strike when the invaders are distracted. Without waiting for a response, Varlon turned to Kor, the leader of the Deathworlders, who had been coordinating their attack. Prepare your soldiers. We're going to make our final push. Kor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. You'll have our best, he said, his voice low and filled with resolve. The team was quickly assembled. Varlon, a handful of Iridian soldiers, and a squad of elite Deathworlders, each of them armed and ready for the most dangerous mission they had ever undertaken. They would board the invader flagship, infiltrate its core, and disable its power source, all while fending off waves of enemy soldiers. The battle raged on, and as Varlon and his team made their way toward the launch pads, the full weight of their task settled in. The odds were overwhelming, but there was no turning back now. As the team ascended into the sky aboard their sleek assault craft, they watched from the windows as the final push began. The reinforcements had indeed shifted the tide, but it was still a bloody, brutal battle. Thousands of lives were at stake, and the enemy had no intention of surrendering. Varlon felt his heart race as the assault craft broke through the atmosphere, heading straight for the invader flagship. Below, the battlefield swirled with chaos, but the team's focus was singular. They would board the flagship, reach the core, and strike. The doors to the flagship opened, and a terrifying silence fell over the group. They were met by a force of invader soldiers, ready for the fight of their lives. But they had underestimated the Deathworlders. With Kor at the front, they fought their way through the ship's hallways, their weapons cutting down enemy soldiers as they pushed forward. Varlon and Zira followed closely behind, knowing that every step forward brought them closer to their objective and closer to certain death. When they finally reached the power core, the team was exhausted, their bodies battered and bruised from the relentless fighting. But there was no time to rest. They planted the explosive charges, and with a final glance at each other, they initiated the countdown. As they made their way back to the extraction point, the ship trembled, and the invader flagship began to implode. A wave of shock and energy rippled through the battlefield, and the invader fleet faltered. With the flagship destroyed, the invaders' control over their forces was broken. The remaining ships began to retreat, their commanders scrambling to regain order. The Deathworlders and the Iridian's allies pressed their advantage, pushing the invaders back once and for all. Varlin and his team barely made it out in time. As they returned to the planet's surface, their craft was met with cheers from the survivors. The invaders were beaten. Iridian was safe, but the cost was great. The death toll was staggering. The battlefield was littered with the fallen. Their sacrifice had paved the way for victory. And though the invaders were defeated, there was no denying the truth. The war had changed them all. Iridian had survived, but at what cost? The Deathworlders, their fierce warriors, had given everything to ensure that Iridian would not fall. They had fought not just for the Iridian, but for the survival of countless worlds across the galaxy. Varlin stood at the front of the command center, watching as the sky cleared. Iridian was free, but the shadows of war would always be with them. The galaxy had seen the rise of a new alliance, forged in the fires of battle. And the Deathworlders had proven that when the universe called for warriors, they would answer. Iridian had been saved, but the journey ahead was uncertain. For the Deathworlders, for Iridian, and for the galaxy, this was only the beginning of a much larger story.